first and foremost, I'm thrilled to be with you here today, and sorry about all the technical difficulties. But yeah, becoming an author, wow. I remember as a child, I used to always tell my mother that I wanted to become a writer when I grew up. And, you know, this is just one of the many things that children say, but I really meant it. However, I never thought that I could indeed become an author because um, not many people that I knew could actually make a living from the arts. So I thought I need to become something that eventually pays the bills. And as I grew up, however, I dedicated myself to academia. So I earned a bachelor's degree, then two master's degrees, and I became a teacher of English as a secondary language. And the moment I lost my job as a teacher because of a move, being a military spouse, my career always had to come after my husband's career. Um, and it was in that moment, oddly enough, when I thought I lost my identity as an individual, as a career woman. It was in that moment that I started writing. And that was over 10 years ago. And that's how I began my career in publishing.
That's amazing. I love that story that, you know, seemed like things were ending and yet you found this kind of new identity and new life for yourself. And tell us about your children's book series and how did that come about? What was the inspiration? It's a Stroke of Magic, and that's all about teaching kids about hidden figures of history. Can you tell us more about that?
Of course. So during my academic career, I focused a whole lot on gender studies, female role models that were overlooked by history because of their gender, because perhaps of their race, immigrant status. So I've always had a passion for this topic, and especially female historical figures who had been discredited, or their discoveries and their advances in humanity and history were overlooked or credited to men because they were women. However, the idea of A Stroke of Magic, the children's book series that I wrote, actually came from a drawing. My illustrator, Valerio Mazzoli, we're close friends. And we had previously worked on another project together for a mutual client, but we stayed in touch. And one day he tells me, I drew this so many years ago. Why don't you write a story about it? I saw the drawing, and it had three children, one grandpa, and they were surrounded by dinosaurs. So I thought, oh my goodness, this is such a cute drawing. I would love to tell a story based on this drawing. But I didn't just want to tell yet another story about children who meet dinosaurs. I wanted to mean something. I wanted the story to have depth. So I started writing, and as many authors know, you have an idea in your head of what the story is going to be like, and then the characters just take over, and the story eventually somehow writes itself. And from that drawing of three children with the grandpa surrounded by dinosaurs came A Stroke of Magic, The Dinosaur Woman. I wanted to include the story of Mary Anning, the pioneering woman whose discoveries contributed to the theory of evolution put forth by Charles Darwin. And I wanted to play my part in making sure that her name is never going to be lost to history amnesia again. So I wanted to include her in my story. And that's how the idea of a children's book series where we use magical realism and we have these three children go on fun adventures through time to discover the truth about a historical figure whose name has been lost. That's how it came about.
Now, you could have gone the route of, because you do have this academic background, you could have written a nonfiction book. What made you decide to make it into this? I mean, you kind of already hinted because it's a very fun adventure, but what made you decide to do fiction versus nonfiction?
After so many years in academia. I, my brain, I noticed my brain was just wired for nonfiction. It was all about, everything I wrote throughout my studies was all about proving facts and making sure that they were historically correct, that I had sources that I could cite and so on and so forth. But then I became a mother. And when I became a mother, I started reading children's book stories to my children at bedtime. It was by reading these stories that had magical realism in them and that were so much fun to read that I finally was able to find freedom in imagination again.
Mm-hmm.
I found purpose in imagination. I found strength and empowerment in imagination. And suddenly the barriers that have been set, that have been put in my brain during my academic career broke. When they broke and I finally started feeling free to express myself and express the many stories that had been somehow trapped in my head for so many years, that's when I decided I don't want to just write a nonfiction book. Also because there are quite a few fiction books out there that focus on Mary Anning, and they're brilliantly written. And I wanted to bring something new. I didn't want to write yet another one and just add to the conversation. I wanted to simply teach and educate children as well as adults, because so many adults have come to me since my book was published telling me, I've always been a dinosaur expert, or so I thought, and yet I never heard of Mary Anning before. I've never come across her name. So I wanted to educate children as well as adults on these historical figures without making them feel like they're sitting down for a lecture.
Right. Right. And I can totally relate to your story about why you decided to do fiction. I wasn't in academia for as long as you were, but after graduate school, I remember all I wanted to do was read fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, it was too much to try and do any more nonfiction. But like you said, it brings something different to the conversation. There are a lot of kids who maybe aren't going to sit down and read a nonfiction book, but they'll get drawn in by the adventure and the magic of what you've created. So let's talk about representation in your books. Now, obviously, you are shining a spotlight on these women in history. So the people that you choose to spotlight, of course, that's representation, but also in the characters themselves. They're Italian-American twins, and then there's this friend of theirs or someone they meet who's Afro-Panamanian. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about that, about why it was important to you to include that diversity in those characters, and then how you decided, I mean, Italian-American is more obvious choice, but and why Afro-Panamanian?
Yes, so it really started happening, the need to seek representation and diversity in children's literature in general when I became a mother. I'm mother to two children, an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. And through the years, I noticed just how non-diverse and quite obvious the characters were in children's books. So as somebody who was born and raised in Italy, southern Italy to be precise, I kept on looking for children's books where the characters could somehow, I guess my children could somehow relate to the characters because they were bilingual, bicultural. There were only few and far in between that I could actually find, and most of them were not Italian American. So at the same time, I also started noticing how the media, Hollywood, has portrayed Italian American culture and Italian Americans quite stereotypical. And I didn't find myself properly represented in American media as well as movies. There were many representations that to me seemed to be stuck in the 1950s. And I wanted this beautiful country that has adopted me to know that as Italians, we've moved on. So I also wanted my children to be proud of their heritage. and not just be teased because in school because of what people assume Italian Americans represent. So I knew that as a mother, as well as an author, I had a responsibility, a huge responsibility to make sure that Italian American children all over the country could see themselves respectfully represented in the books that they read, and no longer represented as children stuck in the 1950s, as I've said before. So that was the reason why I chose Italian American twins, Alex and Ella, to be two of the three children protagonists in my children's book series. The reason why I chose Afro-Panamanian Lila is actually because I have been working with a client of mine, an author, who wanted to write a children's book about a little girl of Afro-Panamanian heritage who moves to New York City when she's 8 years old. And this was actually based on her true story, quite autobiographical children's book. And she explained to me that as a child, she kept looking for books representing her. And her actual heritage, Afro-Panamanian, she couldn't find any. Now, as a mother, she told me, I still can't find any. So my children now still don't see themselves represented in children's literature, and I need to change that. We started talking about our culture, and I thought it was so incredibly interesting because me, for one, for example, I was ignorant about Afro-Panamanian culture and how rich it is. It was her story that made me decide I need to contribute to that conversation as well. But of course, not being Afro-Panamanian myself, I wanted to really represent the culture with the utmost respect. So I sought help from an Afro-Panamanian woman. Her name is Blanca, and she is co-owner of the Panama Folklore in Seattle. And she helped me with the representation of Lila and her abuelita in a Stroke of Magic. And she's also going to be helping me in book 2 and book 3 and book 4 and the rest of the series.
I love that because you really are, like you said, this, when we talk about diversity, you know, that has so many different aspects to it. And these are two groups that really aren't well represented. And I also really love that you are working with someone who is from that culture, so you can really represent it in a respectful, authentic way, because I think that is also another piece of it that sometimes gets missed. So I love that you are being so careful about doing that and to represent these cultures. So can you tell us more, speaking about more diversity, about the new book that's coming out? So we've talked about Mary Anning, and now you've got a second one coming. When can we expect to see it, and then who is it going to be focused on?
So book number 2 was actually inspired by the love and passion that my daughter, 7-year-old Rossella, whose character of Ella is based upon. She's been incredibly passionate about Polynesian culture. And she's been attending Polynesian dance classes, as well as she's learning Tahitian and Hawaiian through these classes and dances that she performs. By bringing her every week to her dance classes that are taught by people from incredibly talented women and beautiful women from Polynesia. So we're talking about Guam, we're talking about Hawaii, and Samoan Islands, and so on and so forth. I became interested in it as well, in Polynesian culture. And I wanted to learn more because, again, I was completely ignorant before then. So I started talking with these incredibly talented women, and I learned more about the history, the Polynesian history, what colonization meant to them, and the many things that colonization has threatened, such as the loss of their native languages. Um, some of them have been declassified to, downgraded to dialects, which is something that really hit close to home for me because Southern Italy, before the unification of Italy in 1861, Southern Italy was its own kingdom. And the main language used also in bureaucracy and official documents was Napolitan. After Italy was unified in 1861, Napolitan was downgraded to a dialect and forbidden in schools, in public areas, no longer allowed in official documents. And I remember growing up as a child, everybody from my teachers to my parents told me, you can't speak Napolitan because only uneducated people speak Napolitan. So I grew up with the assumption that speaking dialect meant you're not educated, you're not well-mannered, you're ignorant, you're somehow at the bottom of the pyramid. During my studies and my research, I found out that history books I studied in school, I guess, revealed their own version of what actually happened. And I rehabilitated Napolitan dialect, which I'm happy to say, along with many other languages in Southern Italy, has finally been recognized as an official language now. But it took so many years. It took centuries to get there once again. So when they told me about, and when I started reading about how colonization had affected Polynesian islands, how their culture and the way that they love to show their values through dance and songs and so forth had been forbidden, I immediately, as I said, it hit close to home. So I wanted to learn more. By studying, because again, you can take academia, well, you can take the academic out of the academia, but you can take academia out of the academic. So I started studying and researching and so on, and I learned about how much the Kingdom of Hawaii had, fought to maintain their values and their culture and their language alive and intact, even before becoming the 50th state of the United States of America. And it was during this research that I came across the beautiful figure of Kaiulani, Princess Kaiulani, the last Hawaiian princess. So I wanted to, it really spoke to me. Her story spoke to me, as well as the story of the people of the Kingdom of Hawaii spoke to me. And I wanted to make sure that I incorporated the beauty of the culture and the importance of retaining one's own native language into the series. So I decided that for book 2, my 3 protagonists were going to travel through time again by jumping in a painting once more, thanks to the help of the magical paintbrush Shemet. And they travel all the way to Hawaii to meet Princess Kaiulani, who is going to share with them the importance of preserving one's own culture through traditions and language.
That's beautiful. I can't wait to read it. I was really excited when I saw your announcement, especially because I think we had already scheduled our interview at that point. So I was excited to learn more about it. And now I'm curious how far, I know you've talked about how the series is going to go into books 3, 4, 5, and so on. So do you have picked out who the other heroes you're going to be highlighting are? Is that something you can share, or do you want it to keep it as a surprise?
Well, I'll tell you that I have indeed, and I want my historical figures to be as diverse as possible. So, for book 1, we went to England in the early 1800s, and now for book 2, we're going to Hawaii. For book 3, perhaps we travel back to Italy, to my home country. And for book 4, who knows? But definitely I have quite a long list of historical figures that unfortunately have been marginalized. But I hope that through this book series, I can share their stories in a fun way that doesn't feel lesson-like or heavy for both the children and the parents who read them.
Definitely, definitely. And I love that you are making it such a fun history to learn about. Unfortunately, like you said, there are a lot of stories to choose from that need to be highlighted, but I love that you're doing this. But before we let you go, I do want to give you a chance to talk about your the military editor agency, because that's another important part of your work, which in some ways is totally different, but is also related because, you know, we're talking about books. So that is an agency that caters to military authors, military related stories. Tell us, what was the need that you saw that you wanted to fill with your agency?
Well, after I started working as a ghostwriter and editor in the publishing industry, in the American publishing industry, I was helping so many incredibly talented authors tell their stories. And at the same time, I was living and breathing the military life, being a military spouse myself. But I noticed that the two worlds I was a part of, the military world and the publishing world, almost didn't seem to know about each other's existence. And I kept thinking, the military community I'm honored to be part of has the best stories. So why aren't they writing books about their stories of resiliency, of strength, fun travelogues as well, because we get to travel all over the world. And why isn't the publishing industry, the mainstream publishing industry, aware that we have so many stories here? So I understood that there was a preconceived notion of military members being the 1% of American population. Their stories are only going to appeal to the 1%. And that's when I decided, okay, no, that's not true, because it's not about a story of going to war and doing things that most people don't get to do. It's about emotions. What does it feel to leave your family behind? Or what does it feel to be the family left behind? Emotions are universal. So there is the possibility to reach a large audience. And that was the moment I decided to bridge the gap between my two worlds and create the military editor agency that caters exclusively to, as you said, military authors and military related manuscripts.
And do you feel like your work as an editor, how has that influenced your work as an author and vice versa? When you started the agency, I knew you said you had been doing ghostwriting, but that was before you had actually started writing your children's books, right? Or am I?
That's correct. Yes, it was way before. Well, it gave me the strength to take that step out of my little safe world of the joy of writing books, but then not having to deal with the stress and the anxiety of, oh my gosh, everybody's going to read what I wrote, right? So we, as authors, we want to tell this incredible story that we have in our heart and in our head, but then we panic, or at least most of us panic the moment we know somebody's reading our book, because we become vulnerable. And I didn't feel ready for the most part to be in that place until I felt the responsibility as a mother of, you need to do something. You need, if you want to see Italian Americans respectfully represented in children's literature, you're a writer by trade, you need to do something about this. And it was about understanding also the responsibility that I have, and also surrounding myself with a beautiful community of military authors who, you see, being a boutique agency, I focus on quality, I don't focus on quantity. I know that some agencies are all about the numbers. We have all, these many authors. I don't. I actually pick and choose who I work with. And it is that quality-focused approach that allows me to create long-lasting and beautiful friendships as well with the authors I work with. Because once you start helping another author working on their book, and you really help them step by step, you're there for the phone call where they just want to rip all the pages apart and not have anything to do with it, but you're also there when they win the gold for the Benjamin Franklin Awards at the IBPA. You're there the entire time. So I was surrounded by this incredible group of authors who also encouraged me to take that step and become an author myself. And knowing what it's like now to be an author, I think it's also helped me understand what my authors go through. So it's truly a beautiful, trustworthy, and supportive relationships that are created.
Yeah, it sounds like you've created a really beautiful community there, and so many great books I know that that you have published, and we love getting to see your children's book series. And thank you so much for joining us. If anybody hasn't checked out our Dinosaur Woman or see the announcement about the new book that's coming out, do go check out her page and her, you know, the links in her bio. Thank you so much for being with us and joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye.